So let's talk about the possibilities for the next Warhammer 40k balance pass, who's going to get buffs, who's going to get nerfs, and what are some of the best ways that they could make 40k game balance just a little bit better. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a focus video looking toward the future, and talk about some of the most likely things to crop up on the next Warhammer 40k balanced data slate, which is expected sometime within the next 3 weeks. So far, I must admit, the Arcs of Omen season has actually landed impressively balanced from Games Workshop. As I talked about recently in a big video going through each codex in the game and how broken it was on landing, the vast majority of 9th edition has been rampant power creep, but then basically ever since the Nephilim season, everything's been more or less in line. Obviously still a few armies sticking out the top and the bottom, but far less so than what it was in the past. Over 9th edition, we've had various codexes reach stupid win percents one after another, things like Harlequins, Drukhari and Tyranids all hitting around about 70% there. In Nephilim and Arcs of Omen, generally we've only had about 58% being the worst. It genuinely is a lot better than it used to be, in terms of the competitive scene at least. Obviously though, things can always get better. The next balanced data slate is going to be due out in early April according to Games Workshop's Meta Watch. They said that it's going to be after Adepticon, not before. Makes sense so they don't mess up a big tournament like they did with the LVO. And if all the rumours and leaks are to be believed, this is likely to be the last balanced data slate of 9th edition Warhammer 40k, before presumably the release cycle starts all over again and we start out with a brand new game. I guess we still might get a few rules dropped before then. I suspect that we're going to have a datasheet for that new Commander Farsight, perhaps Boss Snickrot and maybe even someone else as well. But besides a few odd characters, the major changes are going to come to the strongest and weakest armies in the game, at least in Games Workshop's reckoning. At the moment, Games Workshop do really have a pattern for their balance updates now. Their usual procedure is that points updates don't come out mid-season anymore, they come out at the same time as they change all the missions, and if they do make changes to an army in the sort of mid-season balance pass, as this one would be, they generally change rules as per the balance data slate, and don't go reissuing the Munitorum field manual and fiddle all the points up and down. I think that design is just to stop people getting overwhelmed with points changes, so at least by anything being spectacularly unbalanced, you know that they're going to be set for 6 months after you've read the new set. I think there's pros and cons to this. Lots of things can be fixed quite well with rules, but for some armies it's hard to help out their internal balance without helping points as well. In terms of who's going to be affected by these rules changes, Games Workshop did drop some pretty heavy hints in their Meta Watch video. Their usual methodology is to focus nerfs on anything that's sticking out the top of their 55% ideal win targets, and that'll be Dark Angels and Genestealer Cults as things stand, though they did mention that armies that are just a little bit below them might also attract a bit of attention if they are likely to be the next best thing once their main competitors are nerfed. They specifically called out Demons and Custodies for that, though I sort of feel like from other independent sources away from Games Workshop, Iron Hands and Inari are also very firmly in that same sort of bracket, and they could also attract attention. For lower win rate armies, they singled out Thousand Suns and Deathwatch, both being below their 45% win rates, though with these balance passes they haven't tended to make too many updates to the individual Space Marine chapter books. Say for example there was no mention of the Imperial Fists, despite basically languishing all edition in 9th edition with something like 25% wins, and being one of the weakest armies in the game due to being outclassed by other Space Marines. Depending on what data comes out for the rest of the armies though, there's potentially a whole load of armies that are kind of borderline in trouble. Games Workshop considers 45% their minimum cutoff before they start buffing things, and there really are a crazy amount of armies that are just clustered around that level. Things like Admech, Tyranids, Chaos Marines, Sisters, Necrons, Blood Angels, Death Guard and Drukhari. All of those appear to be hovering around 45 to 46%, so maybe do have the potential to attract attention if they do badly over the next few weeks. Let's talk through their potential target armies though, and how they might fix them. First up we've got the Deathwatch, who are arguably the weakest major faction currently. Their tournament win rates are around 37%, massively lower than the next competitor unless you count individual Space Marine sub-factions. Generally people see Deathwatch as a bit different, as fairly divergent with their unit choices. The biggest problems for them at the moment are that they have kind of bad comparative balance compared with the other Space Marines. The combat doctrine change meant that Deathwatch's own unique combat doctrine system is actually a negative to them in many cases, and the points changes comparing their kill teams to say things like Sternguard veterans or Devastators aren't particularly favourable either. A lot of their core codex rules are quite good I think, but doesn't seem to make up for these shortfalls, and special issue ammunition has been kind of bad ever since this latest codex got released. In terms of ways that they might give them a boost, I feel like their combat doctrines might be a fairly obvious one to change. Seeing how much they're struggling, they could maybe just go completely de-restrictive and just let them choose their combat doctrine each turn. Might be an interesting sort of prospect if they could just jump from, say, Devastator to Assault back to Devastator again, if it made sense. That would actually give them a bit more flexibility, and unlike other chapters, they don't have a unique combat doctrine of any sort, so they don't get an improved ones like, say, the Iron Hands do with their Devastator one. Otherwise, I feel like something to help their kill teams might be nice. They could even perhaps incorporate some element of that Army of Renown formation that they had, where they allowed the kill teams to flex out between different chapter tactics. Say all of a sudden all your kill teams become White Scars for a turn if they need to make a long charge, or Imperial Fists for a turn if they need some more bolter damage. I feel like out of rules changes, that could be quite a fun way just to buff kill teams alone, and it would kind of mirror what the AdMech got with their balance changes. They got the 5+ invul save bionics baked into all their units, which was only a thing in the Army of Renown before. If they did want to make another rules change as well, I think special issue ammunition could probably be worth looking at. It used to be basically the main reason to play Deathwatch, which I'm not sure is the ideal state of affairs, but having it be a bit more meaningful and their bolters genuinely be scary could be handy, though how they choose to implement it is maybe a bit more up for debate. Also mentioned on the MetaWatch update were Thousand Suns, where if their win rates stay this low, again they will attract some sort of attention. Again, they were an army that was kind of mid-tier in Nephilim, but got bad balance changes in Arcs of Omen comparatively. Losing Armour of Contempt was really big for them, as it stacked well with all this dust. Their primary units like the Rubrics and the Scarabs didn't really get a points change to compensate them for that. And also Thousand Suns were kind of being propped up by allying in the kind of broken Demon Flamer units with far too much damage for their points, so when they got toned down that also weakened the faction. They did get a bunch of points changes, but arguably to generally bad units. I think the change to Spawn was kind of helpful, but most of the rest just wasn't particularly exciting. Their Psychic secondaries again also aren't massively helped out in the new season, particularly with things like changes to Psychic Interrogation. In terms of giving them a lift, I feel like if this was an end-of-season balance change, then just a small points adjustment to Scarab or Rubric Marines would probably make sense, just something to compensate them from the loss of Armour of Contempt. I don't think it would have to be much. Otherwise, I guess they could change their secondary objectives a bit. That would allow them a few more victory points if their Psychic ones got a bit easier to do, I suppose. But otherwise, I guess you'd be looking at some sort of complex whole faction special rule, maybe a boost to their Kabbalistic rituals or mortal wound output in some way, or maybe changing all this dust to go back to Armour of Contempt, or another durability boost like ignores wound rerolls for Rubrics and Scarabs. I'm not sure they need an absolutely huge boost to get back into the middle of the pack, to be honest, but I feel like just having something that makes their raw efficiency a bit better will be a good idea. Next up, I thought it was worth mentioning the Imperial Fists. They're perhaps a bit different as a bit more of a Space Marine sub-faction as opposed to a full army in their own right, but still in comparative chapter balance, they've had things worse with all of 9th edition so far. They've typically had dreadful win rates in the 25 to 30%, usually because other chapters just do what they do far better. The biggest reasons to play Imperial Fists, I think, competitively are their chapter tactic and Eye of Hypnoth. Then the vast majority of the rest of the codex is kind of passable, at least compared with what other tricks you get from other books. Obviously they're great with bolters, exploding sixes is very nice on them. The problem is that Space Marine bolter units just don't tend to be all that efficient in the current game. I guess perhaps Boltstorm Aggressors getting good again probably helps them out a bit, but I'm not sure if it's enough to carry them to being overall strong. At the start of 9th edition as well, Games Workshop nerfed their combat doctrine for some reason. It meant that they only got the +1 damage against vehicles with weapons that are strength 7 or greater, so you didn't get it on things like heavy bolters, for example. This change in particular was quite strange given that they weren't exactly the hottest chapter at the time, and even if they did have it completely de-restricted, I still consider it a bit of a skewed Devastator doctrine anyway. It's useful if you're fighting vehicles and buildings, but there's plenty of armies that use none of either. It's just far less general purpose than, say, the Iron Hands one. I'm genuinely not sure if Games Workshop will bother to give the boys in yellow any help. I feel like a small boost wouldn't go amiss though, something just to give them an actual genuine edge with certain units in the book. I feel like maybe one interesting way that they could do things was just literally to double down and make their bolters even more dangerous somehow perhaps, maybe give them double exploding sixes rather than just single ones, and truly make bolters something to fear for Imperial Fist armies. I feel like their combat doctrine is maybe the other good way that they could make a change. Even if they just added something like passive reroll ones to hits like the Iron Hands get, I don't think that that will be too much. It'd just feel like they'd be evening up the score a little bit with their Iron Hands brothers, who have far better support options on the whole anyway. Let me know your thoughts though. How would you give the Imperial Fist a helping hand with 1 or 2 simple rules changes? Otherwise, as mentioned, there's a whole ton of lower power armies around the 45% win rate. I'd guess that these probably won't receive that much attention unless they nose below that threshold. Games Workshop does tend to be quite clear about their methodology with these, and they don't tend to mess around with the mid-tier factions too much unless they're changing points. I feel like most of these layering on another special rule or something feels kind of overkill, to be honest. Maybe one simple one though that might be kind of feel good though would be giving Tyranids back their adaptive part of their adaptive traits. In the Codex you could have your Hive Fleet and then just have its basic trait, and then you could tailor the second part to the enemy's army. It is genuinely a helpful thing to be able to do depending on your foe, but I feel like it's not the sort of rule that really gives you such a massive advantage that it's going to flip them from being a kind of weak army to a super strong one. Now they've had multiple layers of datasheet nerfs and a whole bunch of other rules changes as well, I can't help but think that giving this back might be quite a nice feel-good one, maybe put them more in the mid-tier range as opposed to towards the bottom. Turning to look at the top of the meta and the armies that might well receive nerfs, first up we have the Dark Angels, who I'd argue are perhaps the top faction right now. Really quite a lot of people playing them, 58% tournament wins, and have won 7 grand tournaments this season, though I would still bear in mind that even with this, they're not really all that far above Games Workshop's normal target of 55%, and far off some of the horrors that we've seen in 9th edition so far. An uphill struggle for many armies, but not unbeatable by plenty of others. We've talked about Dark Angels on the channel really quite a lot. Their main strengths just come from the Deathwing, Ravenwing, and the support that both wings can get. Deathwing have Thunderhammer Stormshield Terminators for 33 points, bonus Cyclone Missile Launchers, and permanent Transhuman Physiology from Inner Circle, only being able to be wounded on a 4+, and overall they're just ridiculously efficient. Ravenwing really liked all the changes and points cuts to fast attack units, plus permanent Devastator Doctrine giving them an extra 3-inch move and the ability to get a 4+ invul save while Jink and still be able to fire their heavy weapons, albeit with a -1 to hit penalty. Means that they can just zoom around the table deleting things and be surprisingly tough to take down in return. Then back that all up with some very decent generic support characters. Azrael and Lazarus are nice in the centre of a battle line. The Ravenwing Apothecary is excellent for healing either Deathwing or Ravenwing. Ezekiel has some awesome psychic powers, and their chapter tactic isn't exactly a bad one either. If you can afford to stay still or you're fighting in your opponent's turn, +1 to hit is great. In terms of possible changes for them, I think one that's almost certainly going to happen is one that Games Workshop hinted last time, and it's probably going to be a nerf to Codex Warfare. That's the secondary objective where you score points for killing enemies with the appropriate weapons in the right combat doctrine, and with the combat doctrine updates, they forgot to change the Devastator one back to 1 point per kill. Previously it was 2 points per kill because you only got 1 turn to be able to do it. It just means that for Ravenwing Heavy Dark Angels units, or armies like Iron Hands, they can have a massive amount of victory points just for killing some of the enemy army. Another thing I've seen mentioned a couple of times in other online discussions is maybe having some sort of limits to the amount of turns of Devastator Doctrine you can get. So far GW has been a bit binary with this. They've had times in the game where you just get unlimited Devastator Doctrine, they've had times in the game where you can only have it for 1 turn and not more, and generally it's either super weak or super strong with no in between. They could maybe go for a middle ground, say you get 2 or 3 turns of Ravenwing or Iron Hand's Devastator Doctrine, and then you have to move on to Tactical. That might help create a bit more of a happy medium between the Devastator Doctrine chapters and the rest. Otherwise though, if they did want to target Dark Angels specifically, maybe things like either the Jink or the Inner Circle rule might be some of the better ways to do it. Ravenwing are super fast, so maybe shouldn't be quite so durable. They could make Jink a 5+ invul save or a 6+ if they don't advance, rather than the 4 to 5 invul save that they have at the moment. For the Deathwing, I guess you could make Inner Circle mini transhuman perhaps, though I kind of feel that this might be a bit overkill and sad for the Deathwing. I think that the main issue is that they can just apply it to Thunderhammer and Stormshield Terminators and not pay any more points for it, when it's a massive upgrade compared with just about any other chapter. I know they don't normally do points updates with these balance things, but maybe just saying like Inner Circle costs an extra 2 points per Terminator or something, I feel like that wouldn't be unreasonable. Otherwise, in terms of tournament win rate, sharing the top spot with the Dark Angels at the moment are the Genestealer Cults. Very similar tournament win percentage of 58%, and 4 grand tournaments won in Arcs of Omen, which is very impressive considering their pretty tiny player base. Compared with the Dark Angels, I would say that the Genestealer Cults are maybe a little bit more debatable, as if they really need fixing, to be honest. They're still not really the easiest army to use to peak efficiency, and a couple of small mistakes or bad luck with fragile units can sometimes swing a whole game. if you're not familiar with using their tricks to the absolute maximum advantage. However, the numbers don't really lie too much. At the top end of competitive play, they are very, very strong right now. Perhaps the biggest deals for them are the massive amount of control of the game that they have. They generally tend to be the active player, and the other player tends to be more reactive to them and the tricks that they can do. Their ambush deployment means they're quite hard to screen or zone out. It means they'll often be able to rack up some very high secondary scores without too much effort, and their secondary objectives are pretty nice in their own right. And also, just as a slightly less commonly played faction with some really weird stuff that they can do, a lot of people are just less familiar with their strongest tricks or the best ways to play against them. With so many options for what the Genestealer Cult players might be able to do, it's hard to know exactly where to go on the board, and if units get isolated, they could quite easily get picked off by massive melee out of deep strike or big crossfire attacks. My first thought for Genestealer Cults is that it might be the best answer to perhaps do some sort of nerf to their secondary objectives, as opposed to changing the rules for the army outright. At the moment, I feel like their codex is pretty well balanced, lots of units that work well in concert, but most of the individual ones don't seem overpowered on their own. With the army's deployment rules and the ability to have loads of OBSEC units popping up from nowhere, they're just quite hard to outscore. And if they made some of their secondary objectives a bit harder to achieve, like Broodstorm, that might genuinely be all that they need to be reined in a bit and still be a strong faction, but not winning quite so much. Finally, Games Workshop did mention that they might well be looking at the armies that are just a little bit below the top two, and may hand out some sort of lesser nerfs to these ones just to make sure they don't step into the void and become the next top dog. I suspect that some of these might escape the balance hammer altogether, but I feel like these guys are perhaps in the danger zone for copying at least some sort of tone down. Iron Hands with their big damage, Custodians with their all-around raw might, Demons with fast-moving and fairly efficient durable units with the demon saves, and Inari the best scoring faction of Eldar. I guess for Iron Hands, if they did nerf that Codex Warfare secondary, as it seems like they're likely to do for the Dark Angels, that could rein them in a bit, at least take the edge off a few of their victory point scores. Again, any small change to the Devastator doctrine, say only being able to get 2 or 3 turns of it, again would impact them quite a bit. Custodians are the most commonly played competitive faction right now. If people are choosing to nerf them, maybe you could think about restricting the Esteemed Amalgam stratagem again. That was one of the options that was de-restricted, and now they seem to be very, very strong. I feel like that might be reasonable enough to tempt a few more people away from playing Emperor's Chosen as well, which still seem to be the most dominant shield host that people tend to pick. For the demons, I feel like a lot of their strength just comes from raw, very powerful datasheets, which you can't really do much about if you're not changing points. Maybe a nerf to secondary objectives might not be the worst for them if you did want to turn them down if GW choose to. I must admit, maybe I'm a little bit uncertain what they'd want to do about Inari, if anything. Most of their raw strength doesn't exactly come from their craft world attributes. I guess it's not impossible they might choose to change the rules around for the Incarn in some way. The avatar of Iniad does seem to be included in just about every single Inari list, so perhaps could attract attention as an auto-include for the faction. Whether or not any of these will get attention, though, is a bit more questionable. I feel like Dark Angels and Genestealer Cults are well in the danger zone at the moment, but these guys might well escape by unscathed. In any case, let me know what you think that Games Workshop might do with the next 40k balance pass. If you were in the game designer chair, what would you do to help out 40k's most struggling factions, or rein in the ones that are winning the most at the moment? Look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming. I do tend to post new stuff just about every day. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel quite a bit, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that one linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.